want to invite everybody to close your eyes, and I'm going to ask a series of questions, and I want you to contemplate in your mind in response. How willing are you to suspend what you think you know in order to receive something you don't know? Are you willing to hang out in cognitive dissonance, to not get it, and to feel the confusion of not getting it? Are you willing to be suspended in midair? For how long? For what? For who? Will you pray with me? God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, for you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So you've heard the phrase, she's got her head in the clouds, right? Anybody ever had that said about them? What up, dreamers? He's got his head in the clouds, aloof, flighty, daydreaming. They've got their head in the clouds. They're not realistic. They're not grounded in reality. Detached. To have one's head in the clouds as a human upon this earth, and for the record of those who are geeky, there are clouds on other planets. I learned that this morning. But on this planet, to have your head in the clouds is to be looked upon with judgment. Somewhere on the path to adulting, we are taught to have our bodies and minds planted in reality, in what's rational. If we appear as though our heads are in the clouds, we might be brought back to earth by some form of criticism, some kind of shaming. In the metaphoric version of this human impulse, the cloud appears to be too far off, too elusive, too unworthy of human escape. But I want us to notice something in the text from this morning. A bunch of wild and unworldly, irrational stuff happens in this story. And it isn't until the cloud comes that the disciples hear from God. So, verse 2, Jesus is transfigured, meaning he changes form, and we are told that he is specific. He's shining and dazzling. See, Charlie? Jesus really is your ancestor. So Jesus goes from ordinary to extraordinary, from plain face and plain clothes to Jesus fabulous. He's transformed. That's not natural. It's not rational. And then next, Moses and Elijah show up and talk. So those are dead people. And somehow they're back and they're talking. Dead people having a conversation with living people. That's not natural. That's not rational. And as if that's not enough, miraculous, make you question reality type of stuff, here comes the cloud. The cloud is bright and it overshadows the disciples, and apparently the cloud comes and there's a voice in it. The power of the cloud is such that the disciples fall to the ground in his presence and become overwhelmed by fear. And then when the cloud disappears, the ancestors are gone and the voice is no longer speaking. When the cloud is gone, it's just Jesus and the fellas. So here's my thesis. That cloud is the apex of this story. It's the necessary ingredient. It's the secret agent. And if we read the cloud conditioned by our Western civilized brains, we miss it. We miss what the cloud is all about. So speaking of Western civilization, it feels important to just quickly name that the most responsible school of philosophy, the school of philosophy most responsible for spreading Western thought to the entire world, is known as modernism. And the key philosopher in modernism was René Descartes, and his famous phrase was, "I think, therefore I am." That one phrase sums it all up. Modernism's basic premise is that our entire existence, our fundamental being, is intellectual. Up in the head. Total brain supremacy. And not all parts of the brain. It prized the rational, the quantifiable, objective analysis, science over creativity, tangible over mystical. If you grew up in the Western world, which all of us did, I think most of you did, you cannot have escaped this cultural conditioning. It's at the heart of our culture, which means it's really easy to read a story like this one and dismiss the cloud. But particularly in this story, to miss the cloud is to miss the nature of good discernment. So I'm going to ask that we all get our heads in the clouds for a moment, shall we? Shall we? Are you with me? All right. So clouds have these mystical dimensions to them, and not just because they're wispy and high up in the sky, but because they're suspended in the atmosphere. They're suspended in midair. They're this visible mass that gets saturated either because of cooling temperatures or water vaporizing in the air, and they suspend until they don't anymore. They are objects of transformation, and when we see them, if we stop to truly pay attention, we can't help but observe their art in motion quality. Think about it. Have you ever just taken the time to lie on your back or set your chin to the sky and just watch clouds come to form and then change form and then come to form and then change form and then come to form and then change form? They're magic. They take on these picturesque shapes. Sometimes they dance with each other. As the sunlight interacts with them, they shift in color, sometimes causing sunset scenes that literally take our breath away. Other times they block the sun and they give us shade. Other times they flirt with the baby moon. Other times they drop a downpour of much-needed rain. Yesterday, if any of you were out, they were vacillating between bright white and dark gray, putting the diversity of the season we're in on full display. When the wind gets a hold of them, depending on how the wind feels that day, if you catch my drift, they can move slowly or with a rapid urgency. Sometimes clouds hang out in packs. Other times they're up there totally solo, soaking up all the visual attention unapologetically. They're fluffy. They're puffy. They conjure up comparisons to pillows. They, like their sky companions, stars, can become a map for our mythical projections. In clouds, we see archetypal imagery, warriors, animals, angels, reflections and projections of ourselves. So clouds may be relegated to the realm of the irrational in our society, but next time you hear the phrase, "she's got her head in the clouds," I hope you pause and examine that statement differently. Because I'm here to tell you, clouds show up in the Bible as power-bearing objects. And in Christian history, there's an entire theological tradition born of the cloud. That tradition contains some of the very best writing of some of the very best theologians our world has ever known. Augustine wrote of the cloud. So did Nicholas of Cusa and John of the Cross, and more recently, feminist theologian Catherine Keller and John Caputo. And the foundational text related to the cloud, which has influenced almost all the others, is this anonymous piece of literature that was written in the 14th century, right before the dawn of modernism in Europe, called The Cloud of the Unknowing. Say that back. The Cloud of the Unknowing. It's written in the form of loving instruction. It's kind of like Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet. I don't know if any of you have read that book. It's written to help a person who is trying to learn the disciplines of prayer, who's trying to learn the discernment of discernment, who is trying to achieve some form of union with God. And this anonymous writer, in essence, says, you can't achieve union with God unless you stop thinking. This is the exact opposite of Western modernism. If Descartes' claim is, I think, therefore I am, the Cloud of the Unknowing's claim is, I God, when my brain is suspended in midair. So there's lots of stuff happening in our story this morning, a lot, but it isn't until the cloud comes, it isn't until a visible mass suspends itself in midair that God speaks and God is heard. So let this be an object lesson, not an objective lesson, an object lesson. Sometimes we need to sit by rivers to become more fluid, like water, yes? Sometimes we need to hike and explore mountains to become more solid, more grounded, yes? Sometimes we need to watch the fall leaves spin off their host trees to become people who are more willing to let go, yes? Sometimes we need to have our head in the clouds, literally, to become comfortable with the suspension necessary for true discernment. So do I think a literal cloud came down the day of the Transfiguration? Yes, I do. And do I think the voice of God came as a result of that cloud? Yes, I do. And it doesn't really matter what I think or what you think. The point of the cloud, the power of the cloud, the passion of the cloud is to stop the dominance of thinking. The cloud comes bearing the gift of mid-air suspension. To suspend brain chatter. To suspend racing thoughts. Take a deep breath after every single one of these. To suspend competing ideologies. To suspend righteous judgments. To suspend judgmental voices. To suspend what we think we know. To suspend what we think we don't know. The cloud comes bearing the gift of mid-air suspension. And when our thinking is momentarily suspended in mid-air, guess what happens? There's space. There's quiet. There's receptivity. There's humility. There's a blank canvas with the possibility for artistry. There's room for God to speak. In the work of discernment, it's okay to have your head in the clouds. What we hear when our heads are in the cloud might cause us to tremble, just like the disciples, and it might cause us to fall in reverence, but according to the text, that's exactly when Jesus touches them and says, do not be afraid. So, our capacity to suspend our own beliefs, our own thinking, has a direct impact on God's ability to reach us. Let us all, in the work of discerning our own lives and the future of this church, suspend in midair, get our heads in the clouds as an act of love and worship. Amen.